Welcome back. As you all know, our political discourse right now is in the gutter and, if possible, could get even worse as our president gears up for the re-election race. But it wasn't always the case. I'm not trying to make it that it was all rainbows and sunshine, far from it. But there was a time when politicians actually spoke about the issues and tried to bridge the divide. Bobby Kennedy, he was one of them. He spoke out against the divisiveness, and he also did it at a time when the country was in the middle of an unpopular war in Vietnam. The civil rights struggle was at its zenith. Well, a new book, it tells Kennedy's story by using his own speeches and comments. It's called RFK, His Words for Our Times. Co-author Rick Allen, he joins us. Before we get into some of the seminal speeches that he had and the relevancy, not just for those times, but also now, can you explain why there are so many people where the first name that they identify with the one, whether it was Dr. King, even Jack Kennedy, but the loss that for them was the most painful and the person that they thought cared the most for them, they go to Bobby. What was it about him, if you can articulate, that still, 50 years later, gets him choked up?
Well, I think there were a lot of reasons, and related to his passing, but even more importantly, related to his life. He was enormously accessible. He was literally accessible to crowds. He spoke everywhere, met people all over the world. His cufflinks were ripped off on almost every time he went through a crowd. So he was physically accessible, but he was also emotionally accessible for audiences. They understood how deeply he believed in what he was speaking about and where he wanted to take the country and where he thought the world was headed. And I think that was enormously appealing to people of all ages at a time when our country was certainly as divided as it is now.
I want to go through some of the speeches, but put it in today's context. As we're talking about with the Mueller report dropping and the role of the Attorney General, I heard someone point out, well, my God, Jack had his brother Bobby as his AG. You don't think he would have been an advocate? And obviously they were fiercely loyal to each other. But just put in context again, if you could, Rick, what he did as Attorney General versus what we just saw the sitting Attorney General do, explain away not just arguably criminality, but certainly office actions unbecoming of a president.
Absolutely. It's completely different, and I find that argument specious on its face. First, Robert Kennedy made very clear when he made the transition to being his brother's campaign manager to being the Attorney General of the United States that he was working for the people of the United States, and everyone who was working in the Department of Justice had to have the same attitude. So his first meeting was to call the Associate Attorneys General into his office and to tell them that they were not allowed to be political in thought, deed, or action. They couldn't go to political events, they couldn't make political donations, and they could not, most importantly, make decisions on behalf of the Department of Justice and the United States government, which were colored by politics.
For a lot of people, obviously the Kennedys were Camelot, and he a child of privilege, but when you saw when he went through Appalachia and how he connected to people there for what you would think he'd have so little in common, and then he delivered that speech in the Mississippi Delta, people of poverty, they believe they weren't just words, but he meant it. Talk about that address specifically in Mississippi that he gave.
Yeah, absolutely, and there are a number of them. There was an important address at the University of Mississippi when he was Attorney General, and when the actions that he and the administration had taken in Mississippi were interpreted as being contrary to the power structure in the South, particularly the white power structure, and contrary to their notion of states' rights.
We must create a society in which Negroes will be as free as other Americans. We know that we must make progress, not because it is economically advantageous, not because the law says that we should do so, but because of the fundamental reason that it is the right thing to do.
But on the trip in '67 that you're referencing, when he went down to the Delta, he was a celebrity. He could command by his presence that television cameras, follow him where he went. But where he took them was deeply, deeply substantive, into the depths of poverty, the extent to which Americans did not know and did not appreciate. And by his presence, he was forcing the television cameras and the American audience to see the conditions in their own country, which were unacceptable to him and unacceptable to most Americans, as being contrary to the values that we hold as individuals and that we hold as patriotic Americans.
Well, there was a speech, Rick, that was obviously unscripted, but arguably one of the most powerful and impactful he did. Dr. King assassinated. We saw American cities, inner cities, literally go on fire as a result of the civil rights leader being gunned down. Bobby Kennedy was in Indianapolis, and while everyone said you got to get him out of a predominantly African-American neighborhood because of what was going on, he chose instead to get on the back of a flatbed, and he talked about his brother, and he talked about understanding, and Indianapolis did not burn that night.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black.
Talk about that address and just how personal it was for RFK.
It was deeply personal, and so he's speaking to the community that is most impacted by the loss of its hero and Dr. King. And he is connecting on the basis of shared humanity, shared American identity, shared pain, and the notion that we will only heal and come together as a nation if we move away from revenge, move away from anger, and focus on love, on peace, and on what binds us together. And you're right, that was a night when more than 112 cities across America burst into flames. Dozens of people were killed, tens of millions of property damage. Indianapolis stayed quiet, and the people of Indianapolis point us to the fact that Robert Kennedy's remarks were a very important element of why that happened.
Well, I think one review of the book said it well. It shouldn't be looked at as a eulogy, but instead a blueprint going forward. For many, not for all, but for many, Bobby Kennedy, the last political hero they ever had. And when you read some of the speeches, at least for myself, you understand why. Rick, I appreciate the time, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's been a pleasure, and the best to you and to your audience.
All right, coming up next, well, we're going to shift gears here and actually talk a little sports. The NFL draft starts about in an hour. The NHL playoffs entering the second round, and yeah, I'm just still alive. We've got all that and much more after the break.